Welcome to the Crafts Are My Vice tutorial for making imitation beaded jewelry with rubber bands using wood skewers. I also have a tutorial using a loom, but this would be my preferred method for making beads. So here's an example of a smaller bead using 3 rows and a larger bead consisting of 5 rows to make up the bead. And this would be my version of a boy's necklace that goes all the way around, or a girl's choker. Certainly can be worn by either boys or girls. And here I have a clasp because that probably won't fit over somebody's head if it's going to be fairly small around the neck. And here's an example of a fatter bead using more bands in each row. And this would be a variation on the chain and a longer bead. So what you'll need for this project to make a necklace would be 100 to 150 bands to make up the chain, and anywhere from 45 to 150 bands to make up the beads. So band selection is pretty important. For instance, this is a stretchier band, these metallic bands, and this one is broken right here. These are kind of 2 crucial bands for the project to pull the bands together to make it look like a bead, and so this one's broken. So this necklace is kind of sunk. But for the most part, the rest of the chain can really be just about any band you would like, but when you want it to be all consistent, then you do have to have a real strong band that is right next to each side of the bead, and preferably one that's not overly stretchy. However, for the bead itself, it really doesn't matter, and actually if they're really stretchy, they're a little bit easier to work with in that area. Now, when we're talking about how many bands you'll need for the project, so I've figured that the chain part of a necklace, it uses about 8 bands to make up an inch, and the first part of the chain can be measured usually from the back of the neck to about the collarbone, and mine ends up usually being about 8 inches. But certainly you can make it to your desired length. And then for bracelets, anywhere from 28 to 32 bands that make up the chain. For a necklace, anywhere from 100 to 150 bands usually works. To make the beads, it's 5 bands per row or more. I wouldn't use any less than that because then you don't have as much distinction between the chain and the bead. So for instance, for making 5 small beads, 3 rows in each bead and 2 colors. Color A, which would be the blue, would be 50 bands, and then color B would be 25 bands, the green. Then if you were to make a large beaded item, if you were to do the boys, this one is about 15 beads. So for 3 rows, to make up the bead in 2 colors, color A, the black, would be 150 black bands, and color B, 75 bands, which would be the green. And then the chain, this one used 64 white bands. Okay, and back to the 3 large beads. This is 5 rows to make up the bead, 2 colors. So color A, being the fuchsia, was 45 bands, and color B, the pink, 30 bands. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how many bands the project will require. What you'll need for this project are wood skewers, like kebab skewers, and for a pack of 100. These cost $1.29 at the grocery store, and you'll only need 3 for this project. You'll also need something to cut them down with, wire cutters or some sturdy scissors. You'll need to tape off the end, and pencil is optional to mark it with. You'll also need something metal to hook it with. I don't suggest using your plastic hook because they'll likely break. So a knitting hook, a metal knitting hook would work. And what I prefer are these yarn loom knitting hooks. This one was $1.29 at the craft store, and this one runs about $3. And then to clasp your jewelry, you certainly can use a C-clip, or what I like to use are 2 jewelry jump rings and 1 C-clip, or 2 jewelry jump rings and a clasp. And if you use the jump rings, it's sometimes easier to use a ring splitter. Okay, so to begin, the first thing we'll need to do is to cut down the wood skewers. So from the top, hold what's comfortable in your hand and then add 1 inch to 1.5 inches right there. You mark that off. And then we'll cut that. And if you're a child, you should probably ask an adult to do this part. So I'd hold both ends because that point is pretty sharp and you don't want that to go flying and hurt anybody. So cut that. Oh, let's see, I've got an extra bit there. Okay. And you could maybe file that off. I just have sometimes used a regular nail file, or tape it off, or both actually is probably the best thing to do, leaving a little extra tape at the end. Turn that, and then that one's ready. So do 2 more. Once you have 3, we'll be ready for this project. Okay, now to get started. We'll take our 3 wooden sticks with the tape side down. We're going to work off this nice finished side. So we're going to take 2 sticks and hold them between our thumb and our pointy finger, and the 3rd stick behind that pointy finger and holding it with our middle finger. So I know that sounds complicated, but it gets easier after the first few bands. Okay, so we'll take our first chain colored band, put it around the 2 sticks, and then take the band that's closest to you and pull it over that 3rd stick. Then our next band will go around all 3 sticks, and we'll loop those. We'll loop that one. Looping all 3. Okay, push that down just a little bit. Take our next band around all 3. And loop. And after about the 3rd one, then we're well on our way. We can hold it in a more comfortable way without them getting out of order. So all 3, and you can hold it with your thumb. That makes things easier also. 1, 2, and 3. And so I certainly understand that that is a little bit complicated. Things can move and shift. So I have a little bit of a tip for that. Please continue on if you're well on your way. So this is just taking the bottom part of a cup, a styrofoam cup or paper cup, something like that, or maybe even some cardboard, and poking holes in a triangular configuration. And then also, if you're going to be using the jump rings, it makes it a little bit easier to just put the first ring on now. So just slide a ring on your first band. Hold it right there. And then, oops, then you kind of just ignore that ring and pull the side closest to you over that third stick. Go to your next band. And loop over. Okay, loop over. And here's for that third one. And now you'd be ready to pull it out of the cup. So you just continue on, placing a band around all three sticks, loop over each one. And then if you're going to be making a bracelet, go ahead and make sure you've got 4 rows before continuing on. And if you're going to be doing a necklace, then continue on to your desired length, anywhere from 50 to 65 bands are what I use. I measure it from the back of the neck to about the collarbone before I start my beads, but certainly you can do the length as you desire. And then I'll be right back. Okay, so now we have our chain, the first part of our chain. Mine ends up being 8 inches long, and I think 65 beads. So just before we start the beads, the last chain band needs to be doubled or capped. So I'll fold one in half and put it around 2 if I can stretch it over, and I use my hook to stretch it over that third stick, and then loop as I have been. Okay, and then push my sticks up because I'm going to need some room now. Okay, and then to start my beads, I'm going to demonstrate a bead that's the small bead that's 3 rows big, and so we're going to take 5 bands on each row, and I like to set my bands out for each bead so that I don't get confused as to what color comes next. Okay, so that's 5 and then 5. Okay, so first I'll take my blue. Whoops. And put them around all 3 sticks. Hold it with my thumb and loop the capped bands all the way over. And this is where it's nice to have the sticks where I can pull it just a bit, make myself some room to get the hook in there, and then give it a tug. I think that's the biggest difference when you're not using the loom, is to be able to give it that tug. Okay, and the next color, around all three, and loop. So it's certainly fine to loop more than once on a stick. This as long as you get all of the color over, all 5 bands over. And then give myself some room for the next, and a tug. So this is really where I like having the bands laid out in the stacks of colors, because as you can see we have the yellow and the blue, I'm sorry, the green and the blue, but it was actually the blue that had come first. So it gets sometimes confusing, but if you have it laid out, you don't have to figure it out each time you go for bands. So again, looping. And especially that third one, it's tighter. It's nice to be able to pull the stick just a little bit away from the rest to give yourself some room to get your hook in there, especially if you're using a regular knitting hook, crochet hook. So tighten that up. Okay, and then now for the chain in between. For a bigger bead, I would suggest using no less than 5 rows in between, but for a smaller bead, 4 will do just fine. For the bracelets, 4 is fine. If you use any less than 5, the necklace doesn't bend as it should. So on both sides of the bead is always doubled or capped. Whoops. Okay. Pull the third. Okay, and then just loop as we did before. Okay, and pull tight. And then the next couple of chain bands are just single. And pull tight. Okay, and then this will be my last one in this part of the chain, so it's doubled or capped. And then I'll get myself some room. And on to the next bead. I'm going to set up my stacks of bands. It's 5 blue, another 5, 5 green. Okay, now I'm ready. Take my blue around all 3 sticks. Guess I give myself too much room. holding it with my thumb, looping over. Okay, then pulling tight. Onto the green. Pull tight. This will be our last row for that bead. Double check to make sure I got all the green bands over. Okay, and then lay out my chain bands, 4 of them. This one's doubled or capped. And then looping. So if you want to pause your video and continue with your beads, and then just remember to cap on or double on both sides of your beads, and then you can also finish out the last part of your chain. If you haven't counted out how many bands it took to make the first part of your chain, you certainly can count them or just measure them, and then we'll pick back up to finish off your jewelry. One last finishing touch is to pull those bands that are on both sides of the beads tight, and I just hold them real close together and give them a little wiggle, and that kind of makes those beads come to a nice close. Gives you a little distinction between the two items, the beads and the chains. Certainly don't pull too hard, you don't want them to break at this point, but give them a little tug just like that. Okay, so now to finish up our project, we're going to put all 3 rubber bands onto one stick, just like this. Okay, and then if we're going to go with the C-clip, you can pull those bands, push them together, pull them tight. Put that C-clip around all 3 bands on this side. And then attach 2 or 3 bands, whichever you are more comfortable with, to this side, and you're done. Okay, so now if we're going to use the jump rings, can we pull that real tight? We'll find the place where the 2 ends meet. Use your ring splitter to split the ring in 2. Pull those real tight, You can capture 2 or all 3 bands. And then I keep those bands pulled, stretched, so that I hopefully minimize the pinching of those bands within the ring till I get that ring all the way on. Okay, so now we've got that ring on. We can remove our stick. So if you're going to use 2 rings in a C-clip, you take your C-clip and just insert it through this jump ring. It fits nice and snug, so it's not really going anywhere. Just like that. And then if you wanted to use a jewelry clasp, I use a claw clasp, but there's certainly other types of clasps out there. You would just take your ring splitter, and it really can be on either side. And just as we did before, we split the ring. It goes on the small end. So feed that through there. And this one, you don't have to be nearly as delicate because it's only metal you're feeding through there. Okay. And there you have your claw clasp, and you're done. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you did like it, please click the thumbs up. If you're interested in more, please subscribe. I have several tutorials in the works. I would love to see your creations on Facebook and Instagram. Much of what I make is available on Etsy. And again, thank you so much.